The grand concert hall of the Vienna Staatsoper stood as a monument to classical music, its ornate ceiling adorned with frescoes that had witnessed over a century of the world's finest performances. On this particular autumn evening in 2019, the venue buzzed with anticipation as hundreds of elegantly dressed patrons filed through its gilded doors, their conversations creating a sophisticated murmur that echoed through the marble corridors. They had come to witness the return of Alina Marchesi, a celebrated concert pianist whose technical precision and emotional depth had earned her international acclaim and a devoted following across Europe and beyond. Alina arrived at the hall 3 hours before her scheduled performance, as was her custom. At 38 years old, she had perfected a pre-concert ritual that allowed her to mentally prepare for the demanding program ahead. This evening's performance would showcase some of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, including Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, a work so technically demanding that even seasoned professionals approached it with a mixture of reverence and trepidation. Alina had spent 6 months preparing for this specific concert, working through every phrase and passage until her fingers could navigate the cascading runs and thunderous chords with what appeared to be effortless grace. As she made her way through the back corridors of the concert hall, Alina's mind was already running through the opening measures of the Rachmaninoff. She barely noticed her surroundings, so focused was she on the task ahead. The backstage area of the Staatsoper was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and storage rooms, a stark contrast to the opulent public spaces that most audience members experienced. Here, the walls were painted a utilitarian gray, and the floors were scuffed from decades of foot traffic from musicians, stagehands, and the countless other people who made the magic of live performance possible. Alina's manager, Thomas, walked beside her, reviewing last-minute details on his tablet. He had been with her for 12 years, managing every aspect of her career from booking performances to negotiating contracts with recording labels. Their relationship was purely professional but deeply efficient, built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it took to maintain a career at the highest levels of classical music performance. Thomas confirmed that the piano had been tuned that afternoon by the hall's master technician, that the lighting cues had been programmed according to her preferences, and that the conductor had arrived and was reviewing the score in his dressing room. They turned a corner and nearly collided with a man pushing a large cleaning cart loaded with mops, buckets, and various supplies. The man was in his 60s, with gray hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades of manual labor. He wore the simple uniform of the venue's maintenance staff, a navy blue jumpsuit with the Opera House logo embroidered on the chest pocket. His name tag identified him as Joseph, though Alina didn't bother to read it. She stepped aside with visible impatience, her heels clicking sharply on the tile floor as she moved past without acknowledgement. Joseph, however, paused and looked at Alina with an expression of gentle recognition. He had worked at the Staatsoper for 42 years, maintaining its halls and ensuring that every surface gleamed for each performance. Over those decades, he had seen countless musicians come and go, from nervous young students making their debuts to legendary masters in the twilight of their careers. He had developed a genuine love for the music that filled the building night after night, often pausing in his work to listen when a particularly beautiful passage reached his ears through the walls and doorways. Thomas was explaining something about the timing of the intermission when Joseph spoke up in accented but clear German. "Excuse me, Miss Marchesi, I have heard much about your performance tonight. Rachmaninoff is very difficult, very beautiful." His voice carried a warmth and sincerity that suggested genuine appreciation rather than mere politeness. Alina stopped and turned, surprised that a janitor would address her directly. Her expression remained neutral, though a flicker of annoyance crossed her features at the interruption of her concentration. Joseph continued, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by Alina's reaction. "I have worked here for many years and heard many great pianists. The piano, it is an instrument that speaks to the soul, yes. When I was young, before I came to Vienna, I also played." He said this last part almost shyly, as though sharing a secret that he rarely revealed. His eyes held a distant look, as if remembering something from long ago, something precious that time had softened but not erased. Alina's eyebrows rose slightly, and she exchanged a quick glance with Thomas. The manager's expression suggested polite tolerance mixed with a desire to move along with their schedule. Alina, for her part, felt a surge of irritation at what she perceived as presumption. In her experience, everyone seemed to have a story about how they once played an instrument, or how their aunt was a piano teacher, or how they had always loved classical music. These unsolicited sharing of musical connections had become tiresome over the years, particularly from people who had no understanding of the grueling dedication required to perform at her level. "That's very nice," Alina said, her tone carrying the crisp dismissiveness of someone eager to end a conversation. She began to turn away, but Joseph, encouraged perhaps by her acknowledgement however minimal, took a step forward. His cleaning cart remained where he had left it, partially blocking the narrow hallway. "The Steinway in the main hall, it is a magnificent instrument," he continued. "I have cleaned its exterior many times, always very carefully. The wood must be treated with special care, but I wonder sometimes about its voice, how it sounds under different hands." Thomas cleared his throat, a polite signal that they needed to continue. Alina nodded in agreement and said, "Yes, well, you'll hear it tonight if you have time to listen. We really must go now." Her words were courteous on the surface but carried an unmistakable edge of finality. She had encountered this type of situation before. Well-meaning staff members or fans who wanted to make a personal connection, to share their own stories, to somehow become part of the world that she inhabited. While she appreciated admiration for her art, she had learned to maintain boundaries, to preserve her energy and focus for the performance itself. But Joseph was not quite finished. Something in his gentle demeanor suggested that he had something more to say, something that he had perhaps been considering for a while. "Perhaps, if there is time before the performance, I might play something for you. Just a small piece, nothing elaborate. I would be honored to share what I remember." He spoke these words with such genuine humility and hope that even Thomas paused in his efforts to usher Alina along. History, waiters circulated with champagne and canapés, and the conversations buzzed with the excitement that always followed a particularly successful concert. Alina moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting congratulations, discussing future performances, and making the kinds of connections that kept a concert career thriving. She spoke with the critics who had attended, answering their questions about her interpretation and her preparation process. She chatted with orchestra board members and wealthy patrons whose donations kept classical music alive in an increasingly commercial world. Through it all, a small part of her mind kept returning to Joseph, to Greta's cryptic comments, to the look of hurt that had flashed across the janitor's face when Alina had dismissed his request and lectured him about professional standards. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that the encounter was trivial and meaningless, that she had nothing to apologize for. Joseph had been presumptuous to ask to play the concert grand, and she had simply explained why that wasn't possible. Any discomfort he felt was his own responsibility, not hers. Yet despite these rational arguments with herself, Alina could not entirely shake a growing sense of unease. As the reception wound down and she finally returned to her hotel near midnight, exhausted but still running on the residual energy of performance, she found herself thinking about Joseph again. What had Greta meant by saying he had studied music seriously? What kind of family situation could derail someone's entire career? And why, if he had genuine musical training, would he be content to work as a janitor in the very building where he might once have dreamed of performing? These questions followed Alina into her dreams that night, creating fragmented images of hallways and pianos and faces she couldn't quite see clearly. When she woke the next morning, groggy and disoriented in her hotel room, the first coherent thought that formed in her mind was a simple resolution. She needed to know more about Joseph Kellerman. Whether this need came from curiosity, guilt, or something else entirely, she couldn't say. But she knew with sudden certainty that the brief hallway encounter had not been as meaningless as she had tried to convince herself. Something about it had lodged in her consciousness like a pebble in a shoe, small but impossible to ignore, and she would not find peace until she understood why. The reception following the concert glittered with the kind of refined elegance that Vienna's classical music establishment had perfected over centuries. Crystal champagne flutes caught and reflected the light from ornate chandeliers, while servers in crisp black and white uniforms navigated through clusters of well-dressed patrons, engaged in animated conversations about the evening's performance. Alina found herself at the center of multiple overlapping circles of attention, moving from one group to another with the practiced social grace that her career demanded. Orchestra board members wanted to discuss future programming, critics sought quotes for their reviews, and wealthy donors hoped to secure her commitment for private fundraising events. Thomas stayed close, managing the flow of interactions with diplomatic skill, ensuring that Alina spent appropriate time with the most important attendees while preventing any single conversation from dragging on too long. She accepted compliments on her Rachmaninoff with appropriate modesty, discussed technical aspects of the performance with fellow musicians, and laughed at the jokes of patrons whose financial support kept institutions like the Staatsoper functioning. The champagne was excellent, though Alina limited herself to a single glass and the canapés were artfully prepared, though she found herself too keyed up from the performance to have much appetite. As the reception progressed and the crowd began to thin, Alina noticed Greta, the elderly violinist from the orchestra, standing somewhat apart from the main groups, holding a glass of wine and watching Alina with an expression that seemed to combine patience with purpose. Their eyes met, and Greta gave a small nod, an invitation. Alina excused herself from a conversation about recording contracts and made her way across the room to where the older musician stood beside a portrait of Gustav Mahler, whose intense painted eyes seemed to observe the gathering with eternal judgment. "You played magnificently tonight," Greta said, her voice warm but carrying an undercurrent of something more serious. "That final cadenza in the third movement was particularly remarkable. You have a rare gift." Alina thanked her, but sensed that Greta had not positioned herself here simply to offer praise. There was a deliberateness to the older woman's presence, a sense that she had been waiting for an opportunity to speak privately. "I wanted to continue our conversation from earlier," Greta said, confirming Alina's intuition. "About Joseph." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "I may have given you the wrong impression by being vague. The truth is, I know more about his story than I initially shared, and I think perhaps you should know it as well." Alina felt her stomach tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name, something between curiosity and dread. She nodded for Greta to continue, and the two women moved slightly away from the remaining clusters of people, seeking a more private corner of the reception room. Greta took a sip of her wine before beginning, her eyes distant as though looking into the past. "I came to the Vienna Symphony in 1984, so I never knew Joseph during his student days. But when I started here, there were still people around who remembered him from the conservatory. One of the older stagehands, a man named Friedrich who retired about 10 years ago, he had worked at the Opera House since the 1960s and remembered when Joseph first came to apply for work. Friedrich told me the story one night years ago when we were both here late during a rehearsal break." Alina listened intently, her attention completely focused now on Greta's words. The sounds of the reception faded into background noise as the violinist continued her story, painting a picture of events that had occurred more than 4 decades earlier. "Joseph Kellerman was born in 1955 in a working-class district of Vienna," Greta explained. "His father was a postal worker, his mother a seamstress who took in work at home. They weren't wealthy, but they were respectable, hardworking people. Joseph showed musical talent very young, apparently. By age 7, he was picking out melodies on an old upright piano that his parents had acquired second-hand. His elementary school music teacher recognized genuine ability and convinced his parents to find him proper instruction." Greta paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "Through a combination of scholarship programs and his family's sacrifice, Joseph began serious piano study at age 10. By his teenage years, he was being touted as one of the most promising young pianists in Vienna. When he was 18 in 1973, he auditioned for the Vienna Conservatory and was accepted with a full scholarship. This was a tremendous honor, as I'm sure you know. Only the most exceptional students received such support." Alina nodded, familiar with the conservatory's reputation and the competitiveness of its admission process. She tried to imagine a young Joseph, full of hope and talent, walking through those prestigious halls for the first time, his future seemingly bright with possibility. The contrast with the elderly janitor she had dismissed in the hallway became more painful with each detail Greta provided. "By all accounts, Joseph flourished at the conservatory," Greta continued. "His teachers praised not just his technical ability but his musical sensitivity, his interpretive depth. He won several regional competitions for young pianists. In 1976 and 1977, he performed in student recitals that received positive notices in the newspapers. People in the classical music community were starting to take notice of his name. His professors were already discussing which competitions he should enter after graduation, which teachers he might study with for advanced training." Greta's expression grew somber, and Alina felt her chest tightening, knowing that this promising trajectory was about to be derailed. Then, in March of 1978, tragedy struck. Joseph had a younger sister, Maria, who was 16 years old at the time. She was walking home from school one afternoon when a delivery truck ran a red light at an intersection. Maria was struck and thrown nearly 20 feet. She survived, but the injuries were catastrophic. Her spine was damaged, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. She had multiple broken bones, internal injuries, head trauma. She spent 3 months in the hospital and faced years of rehabilitation and therapy. Alina's hand went to her mouth, horror washing over her as she imagined the devastation this must have caused for Joseph and his family. Greta continued relentlessly, determined that Alina understand the full scope of what had happened. The medical costs were staggering, even with the basic insurance Joseph's father had through the postal service. The family needed special equipment, home modifications for a wheelchair, ongoing therapy that wasn't fully covered. But the financial burden was only part of the catastrophe. Joseph's mother, already fragile in temperament, suffered a complete mental breakdown from the stress and trauma. She became unable to function, requiring supervision and eventually psychiatric care. And then, as if fate had decided one blow wasn't enough, Joseph's father had a massive heart attack 2 months after Maria's accident. He survived, but he was never the same, unable to return to full-time work, himself requiring medical care and medication. Greta paused, letting the accumulation of disasters sink in. Alina felt tears pricking at her eyes, overwhelmed by the avalanche of suffering that had buried Joseph's family in such a short span of time. Joseph was 23 years old, Greta said quietly. He was months away from his graduation recital, which was to be a major event showcasing Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, one of the supreme challenges of the piano repertoire. His professors had high hopes for his future, but suddenly he was the only functional adult in his family. His sister needed constant care, his mother needed supervision and eventually institutionalization, his father needed support. The medical bills were crushing them. The social services available at that time were not what they are today. Alina could barely breathe, imagining the impossible choice that young Joseph had faced. He withdrew from the conservatory in May of 1978, Greta continued. Just like that, his musical career ended before it truly began. He took whatever work he could find, anything that would provide immediate income and health benefits comprehensive enough to cover his family's needs. He worked construction for a while, then in a warehouse, then various other jobs. Eventually, in 1982, he applied for a custodial position here at the Staatsoper. The job offered stable pay, good benefits, and it allowed him to work early shifts so he could care for his mother in the afternoons before she was finally placed in residential care. The violinist looked directly at Alina now, her eyes holding a mixture of compassion and something that might have been gentle reproach. Friedrich told me that when Joseph first came to work here, he would sometimes pause in the hallways during rehearsals, just listening with this expression of such longing and loss that it broke Friedrich's heart. Over the years, Joseph made his peace with it. His sister Maria lived until 2014, eventually gaining some independence, marrying, having children. Joseph helped make that possible. His mother lived to 89 in a good care facility that Joseph's steady employment paid for. His father recovered enough to enjoy 10 more years of life before passing in 1988. Joseph saved his family, but the cost was everything he had dreamed of for himself. Alina realized she was crying, tears running down her face in a most undignified manner for someone at a professional reception. She didn't care. The weight of what Greta had told her, combined with the memory of her own condescending words in the hallway, crushed down on her with almost physical force. Why didn't someone help him? She asked, her voice breaking. Why didn't the conservatory find a way to support him? Why didn't someone step in? Greta's expression was sad but understanding. Some people tried, I'm told. His professors wrote letters, made inquiries about emergency scholarships or grants. But Joseph was proud, and he was also fiercely protective of his family. He refused charity, and he believed that his responsibility was clear. Perhaps in today's world, with crowdfunding and social media and different support systems, things might have been different. But in 1978, a young man from a working-class background faced with that kind of family crisis had limited options. Joseph made his choice, and by all accounts, he has never expressed regret, at least not publicly. He found a way to remain connected to the music he loves by working here, by hearing the world's greatest musicians night after night. In his own way, he stayed in the world he loved, just not in the role he had imagined for himself. Alina wiped at her eyes, not caring that her carefully applied makeup was surely ruined. I was so cruel to him, she whispered. When he asked to play, I laughed at him. I lectured him about professional standards and dedication. I treated him like he was some foolish amateur who didn't understand what real musicianship required. Fresh tears spilled over as the full weight of her behavior crashed down on her. All this time he has worked here, listening to people like me perform, never saying anything about his own past, never asking for recognition or acknowledgement. And when he finally, timidly asked for the simple dignity of playing a few notes on the piano, I humiliated him. Greta reached out and gently touched Alina's arm. I don't tell you this to make you feel guilty, though I understand that you do. I tell you because I thought you should know that the world is more complex than we sometimes see from our positions of success and privilege. Joseph is a good man who made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances. He deserves respect for that, regardless of whether he ever performs another note of music in his life. Alina nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The reception was winding down around them, other guests beginning to depart, but Alina remained rooted in place, processing everything she had learned. When she finally regained some composure, she asked Greta, "Does he ever play now? Does he still practice even privately?" Greta shook her head. "I don't know, he never speaks of it. Whatever musical life he maintains is entirely private, if it exists at all. After so many years away from regular practice, after a lifetime of manual labor, I imagine his hands are no longer capable of what they once could do. Arthritis, stiffness, the simple loss of the muscle memory and conditioning that serious playing requires. But I cannot say for certain. Joseph keeps that part of himself locked away, and no one here presumes to pry." The two women stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Joseph's story hanging between them. Finally, Alina thanked Greta for sharing the truth, her voice still thick with emotion. The violinist nodded and gently excused herself, leaving Alina standing alone beside Mahler's painted portrait, feeling small and ashamed and profoundly shaken by the evening's revelations. Thomas appeared a few minutes later, noting Alina's distressed appearance with concern. She assured him she was fine, just tired from the performance and the long evening. They left the opera house together, stepping out into Vienna's cool night air. Thomas offered to share a taxi, but Alina declined, saying she wanted to walk for a while despite the late hour and the distance to her hotel. She needed time alone with her thoughts, time to process what she had learned and to confront the uncomfortable truths about herself that this day had revealed. As she walked through Vienna's elegant streets, past buildings that had stood for centuries and witnessed countless human dramas, Alina thought about Joseph Kellerman, about the young man full of promise whose life had been derailed by circumstances beyond his control, and about the elderly janitor who had endured her condescension with quiet dignity. She thought about her own life, her career, her successes that now seemed somehow hollow in light of what she had learned. She had been given every advantage, every opportunity, while Joseph had been given impossible choices and crushing responsibilities. By the time Alina reached her hotel room, it was past 2 in the morning, but she knew sleep would be impossible. She sat by the window looking out at the darkened city, replaying the day's events over and over in her mind. The triumph of her performance seemed distant and meaningless now, overshadowed by the weight of her own callousness and the tragedy of a life unlived. She had stood on that stage and received the adulation of hundreds, while Joseph had pushed his cleaning cart through the back hallways, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had once promised to be his home. Alina made a decision in those quiet hours before dawn. She would find Joseph again. She would apologize properly for her behavior. And somehow, if he would allow it, she would try to make amends for the casual cruelty she had shown to a man who deserved far better from the world he had sacrificed so much to serve, even from a distance. She didn't know yet what form this atonement would take. But she knew with absolute certainty that she could not simply walk away from this knowledge, could not return to her comfortable life of performances and praise without confronting what she had done and trying, however inadequately, to make it right. Morning came to Vienna, with weak autumn sunlight filtering through a gray sky that threatened rain. Alina had barely slept, managing perhaps 2 hours of fitful rest filled with fragmented dreams of hallways and pianos and faces she couldn't quite see. She woke feeling exhausted, but driven by a sense of purpose that overrode her physical tiredness. After a quick shower and coffee from the hotel room's small machine, she sat down with her laptop and began searching for information about Joseph Kellerman. The internet yielded frustratingly little at first. Joseph's brief moment of musical promise had occurred in the 1970s, before the digital age, before every achievement and event was documented online and preserved in searchable databases. She found no social media profiles, no contemporary mentions, no digital footprint that would help her understand more about his past. The Vienna Conservatory had a website, but its historical archives section was limited, focusing on the institution's most famous alumni rather than those who had left before completing their studies. Frustrated but not defeated, Alina called Thomas despite the early hour. Her manager answered on the 4th ring, his voice foggy with sleep. She apologized for waking him but explained that she needed his help with an urgent research matter. To his credit, Thomas asked no questions about why Alina suddenly needed to investigate a janitor's background. He simply agreed to help, his professionalism overriding any curiosity he might have felt. They agreed to meet for breakfast in an hour, after which Thomas would use his extensive network of contacts in Vienna's classical music community to see what information could be unearthed. Over coffee and pastries at a cafe near Alina's hotel, she explained more fully what she had learned from Greta and why it mattered to her. Thomas listened carefully, his expression growing thoughtful as Alina described Joseph's truncated career and her own shameful behavior in the hallway. When she finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I know someone on the administrative staff at the conservatory," he said finally. She might be able to access archive student records, or at least point us toward physical archives that haven't been digitized. Give me a few hours to make some calls. Alina thanked him with genuine gratitude, touched by his willingness to pursue this seemingly random investigation without judgment or excessive questions. By early afternoon, Thomas had arranged access to the Vienna Conservatory's physical archives, housed in a basement level of the historic building that served as the institution's main campus. The archivist, a meticulous woman in her 50s named Dr. Schneider, met them at the entrance and led them through security and down a series of staircases into a climate-controlled underground space, filled with rows of metal shelving, holding boxes of documents, photographs, programs, and other materials documenting the conservatory's long history. Dr. Schneider had already pulled several boxes based on Thomas's preliminary information about the time period in question. We have student files, performance programs, newspaper clippings, and faculty meeting minutes from the 1970s, she explained, gesturing to a long table where the materials had been arranged. You're welcome to examine anything here. I'll be in my office if you need assistance. Please handle everything carefully and note that photography is not permitted, though you may take written notes. Alina thanked her and approached the table with something approaching reverence. These boxes contain the documentary evidence of Joseph's lost potential, the physical artifacts of a path not taken. Thomas settled in beside her, and together they began to carefully work through the materials, looking for any mention of Joseph Kellerman. It didn't take long to find the first reference. A program from a student recital in November 1976 listed Joseph Kellerman, piano performing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Alina stared at the faded program, imagining a young Joseph walking onto a stage, sitting at a piano before an audience, doing what she had done thousands of times, but what he had done only a handful of times before his opportunity was taken away. She carefully set the program aside and continued searching. More references emerged as they worked through the boxes. A newspaper clipping from the Wiener Zeitung dated April 1977 reviewed a conservatory competition, noting that young Joseph Kellerman demonstrated remarkable sensitivity in his interpretation of Schumann's Kreisleriana, showing maturity beyond his years. Another clipping from a smaller regional paper covered a performance by conservatory students at a church benefit concert, describing Joseph's playing of a Liszt etude as technically assured and emotionally compelling. Thomas found a folder containing official conservatory correspondence, including a letter dated January 1978, from a Professor Albrecht to the Scholarship Committee recommending that Joseph's full scholarship be renewed for the following academic year. The letter praised Joseph's exceptional progress and dedication, and noted that he was being considered for the honor of performing at the Conservatory's annual graduation concert that spring, a privilege reserved for the most outstanding students. Alina's hands trembled as she read this letter, knowing that the graduation concert had never happened, that the promise documented in Professor Albrecht's enthusiastic recommendation had been cut short just months later. She blinked back tears, determined to maintain composure in the professional setting of the archives, but the accumulating evidence of Joseph's talent and his stolen future was almost unbearable. In another box, they discovered photographs from various student events and recitals. Thomas methodically examined each one, finally finding a group photo from a 1977 masterclass with a visiting pianist. Students were arranged in 2 rows, and there in the back row, third from the left, stood a young man whose face, though 47 years younger, was recognizably Joseph. He looked perhaps 22 in the photo, his hair dark and thick, his face unlined and intense. He wore a shirt and tie, and his posture suggested both confidence and focus. Alina stared at this photograph for a long time, trying to reconcile the promising young musician in the image with the elderly janitor she had dismissed so casually. The most devastating discovery came near the bottom of one of the boxes. It was a poster advertising the conservatory's spring 1978 graduation concerts, listing the works to be performed and the student performers. There, scheduled for May 15, 1978, was Ludwig van Beethoven. Piano Sonata No. 29 in B-flat major, Opus 106 Hammerklavier, performed by Joseph Kellerman. Alina gasped audibly when she read this, and Thomas looked at her with concern. The Hammerklavier, Alina whispered, her voice barely audible. He was going to perform the Hammerklavier for his graduation recital. Thomas, less familiar with piano repertoire, looked puzzled, so Alina explained. It's one of the most difficult pieces ever written for the piano, maybe the most difficult. It's nearly 45 minutes long, technically demanding beyond measure, and requires enormous physical stamina and interpretive depth. It's a piece that professional pianists approach with fear and respect, For a student to be assigned this for a graduation recital would mean that his teachers had absolute confidence in his abilities. This was not a merely competent student. This was someone special. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had been lost. Alina carefully photographed the poster with her phone, despite Dr. Schneider's rules, feeling that she needed a record of this particular document. Thomas tactfully looked away, allowing her this small transgression. The final relevant document they found was a brief note in the conservatory's administrative records from May 1978. It simply stated, "Joseph Kellerman has withdrawn from his studies effective immediately due to family circumstances. Graduation recital cancelled. Faculty expressed regret at the loss of a promising student." The bureaucratic language couldn't hide the sadness of what it documented, the abrupt end of a journey that had begun with such hope. Alina and Thomas spent nearly 4 hours in the archives, working through all the materials from the relevant time period. When they finally emerged back into the daylight of the conservatory's main floor, Alina felt emotionally drained but also strangely determined. She now had concrete evidence of Joseph's ability and promise. Documentation that he had not been exaggerating or romanticizing his past when he mentioned that he had once played. If anything, Greta's account had understated how talented he had been. The conservatory did not assign the hammerklavier to students unless they were truly exceptional. Thomas suggested lunch, but Alina declined, saying she needed time alone to process everything. They parted ways with Thomas promising to be available if Alina needed anything else. She walked through Vienna's streets without a clear destination, eventually finding herself at the Stadtpark, where she sat on a bench overlooking a small pond and thought about everything she had learned. The contrast between Joseph's life and her own could not have been more stark. Alina had grown up in a comfortable middle-class family in Milan, her parents supportive of her musical interests from an early age. When she showed talent, they had found her the best teachers, paid for countless lessons and workshops, bought her a good piano, and encouraged her ambitions without reservation. She had attended an excellent conservatory on a mix of scholarship and parental support, never worrying about money or family obligations. After graduation, she had been free to pursue her career with single-minded dedication, traveling for competitions and auditions, practicing 8 hours a day, building the technical and artistic skills that had brought her to her current level of success. Joseph, by contrast, had been derailed at the moment when his potential was about to bloom into actual achievement. He had been forced to choose between his dreams and his family's survival, and he had chosen his family. Then he had lived for 47 years with that choice, working humbly in the building where he might have performed, listening night after night to other musicians doing what he had once hoped to do. The nobility of this sacrifice, the strength required to endure it without apparent bitterness, struck Alina with force. She thought about her behavior in the hallway, her dismissive laughter, her condescending lecture about professional dedication. The memory made her physically ill with shame. She had embodied everything wrong with the classical music world's tendency toward elitism and gatekeeping, the assumption that those who had not achieved professional success must lack talent or dedication. She had judged Joseph without knowing anything about him, had reduced a man with a complex and tragic history to a stereotype based on his job title. As the afternoon waned and the park began to empty of its lunchtime visitors, Alina made a firm decision. She would return to the Staatsoper and find Joseph. She would apologize properly, fully, with complete honesty about what she had learned and how ashamed she was of her behavior. Beyond that, she didn't yet know what she could or should do, but she knew that simple apology was the necessary first step. She owed Joseph at least that much and probably much more. Alina checked her phone and saw that it was nearly 3 in the afternoon. If Joseph worked an early shift as Greta had mentioned, he would likely be finishing for the day or already gone. She would have to return tomorrow, early in the morning, to find him before he completed his work. The thought of waiting another day was frustrating, but Alina forced herself to be patient. This conversation needed to happen properly, without rush, and she needed to prepare what she wanted to say. She spent the evening in her hotel room, declining Thomas's invitation to dinner, instead ordering room service and sitting with a notebook, trying to articulate her thoughts and feelings. What could she possibly say to Joseph that would adequately convey her regret? How could she apologize for behavior that had been so casually cruel? And beyond apology, what else might she offer? The questions swirled in her mind without easy answers. That night, Alina slept better than the previous night, though her dreams were still troubled, filled with images of the young Joseph from the photograph, sitting at a piano playing music that she couldn't quite hear. She woke before dawn, her alarm unnecessary, and prepared herself carefully for what she knew would be one of the most important and difficult conversations of her life. She chose simple, modest clothing, not wanting to appear in the designer outfits she typically wore for public appearances. She applied minimal makeup and left her jewelry in the hotel safe. This meeting needed to be about honesty and humility, not about status or appearance. By 6:30 in the morning, Alina stood outside the Staatsoper's employee entrance, waiting for someone to arrive who could let her in. A security guard she recognized from her performance days earlier arrived at 6:45 and looked surprised to see her. She explained that she needed to speak with one of the staff members and asked if Joseph Kellerman had arrived yet. The guard checked a log and confirmed that Joseph had signed in at 6, his usual time, and was likely working in the upper-level corridors. Alina thanked him and made her way through the familiar backstage areas, now seeing them with different eyes, imagining Joseph walking these same hallways day after day, year after year, for 4 decades. She found him on the 3rd floor, in a corridor lined with small practice rooms and storage areas. He was on a ladder, polishing brass light fixtures with careful, methodical movements. When he heard her footsteps, he looked down, and his expression shifted from neutral concentration to surprise, then wariness, then something that might have been resignation. He carefully climbed down from the ladder, setting his cleaning cloth aside, and faced her with the dignified bearing of someone preparing to endure whatever unpleasantness might be coming. "Miss Marchesi," he said politely, his accented English carefully neutral. "Is there something I can help you with? If there is a problem with the maintenance of your dressing room or some other facility, I can address it immediately." Alina felt tears prick at her eyes at his formality, at the assumption that she had sought him out to complain about something. She shook her head quickly. "No, Joseph, there's no problem with the facilities. I came to find you because I owe you an apology, and because I learned something about you that has made me deeply ashamed of how I treated you the other day." She paused, watching his expression carefully, seeing confusion and growing discomfort in his eyes. "May we talk somewhere private? I promise I won't take much of your work time, but this is important to me." Joseph stood still for a moment, clearly uncertain how to respond to Alina's request. His weathered hands, still holding the cleaning cloth, tightened slightly, and his eyes searched her face as though trying to determine whether this was some kind of trap or cruel joke. Finally, he nodded slowly and gestured down the corridor. "There is a small staff break room nearby. We can talk there. It should be empty at this hour." His voice carried a wary resignation, the tone of someone expecting disappointment but willing to proceed nonetheless. They walked in silence down the hallway and through a door marked personal nur, entering a modest room with a few mismatched chairs, a small table, a kitchenette with a coffee maker, and a bulletin board covered with staff schedules and announcements. The contrast with the Opera House's public spaces could not have been more stark. Here, the walls were plain institutional beige, the furniture utilitarian and worn, the fluorescent lighting harsh and unflattering. This was the unseeing backstage of the backstage, where the people who made the magic possible took their brief respites from labor. Joseph gestured for Alina to sit at the table, and he took a chair across from her, maintaining a careful distance that felt both respectful and self-protective. He waited for her to speak, his expression guarded but not hostile, the face of someone who had learned long ago to expect little and to protect himself from unnecessary hurt. Alina took a deep breath, knowing she needed to get this right. "Joseph, I came to apologize for my behavior when we spoke the other day. The way I dismissed your request to play, the way I laughed and lectured you about professional standards and dedication, it was inexcusable. I was rude, condescending, and arrogant. I treated you without basic human respect, and I am deeply sorry for that." She paused, watching his reaction. His expression had softened slightly, but he still seemed uncertain about where this conversation was heading. "You were not wrong," Joseph said quietly, his English heavily accented but clear. "The piano was prepared for your performance. It would not have been appropriate for me to touch it. And you were correct that I have not practiced seriously in many, many years. My request was foolish, an old man's sentimental impulse. You do not need to apologize for speaking the truth." Alina shook her head firmly. "No, Joseph. You're being far too generous. What I said was not just about protecting the piano for my performance. The way I said it, the tone I used, it was meant to put you in your place, to make clear that you had no right to even think about playing at my level. I made assumptions about you based on your job, and those assumptions were cruel and wrong." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I learned about your past, Joseph. I know that you studied at the Vienna Conservatory. I know you were a scholarship student with exceptional promise. I know you were preparing to perform the Hammerklavier Sonata for your graduation recital in 1978. Joseph's face went pale and he leaned back in his chair as though physically struck. His hands gripped the edge of the table, and for a long moment he said nothing, simply staring at Alina with an expression of profound shock mixed with something that might have been pain. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. How do you know these things? Who told you about this? Alina explained about her conversation with Greta, about the research she and Thomas had conducted in the conservatory archives, about the newspaper clippings and programs and photographs they had found. As she spoke, Joseph's expression cycled through various emotions: surprise, embarrassment, sadness, and something that might have been anger, though it seemed directed inward rather than at Alina. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long time, his eyes fixed on the table's surface, his breathing slow and deliberate. "That was a different life," Joseph said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "A different person in some ways. That young man full of dreams and ambitions, he disappeared a long time ago. I am not him anymore. I do not think about those days, about what might have been. It serves no purpose to dwell on paths not taken." Despite his words, the pain in his voice suggested that he thought about it more than he claimed, that the loss still lived within him even after all these years. "Greta told me what happened to your family," Alina said gently. "The accident, your sister, your mother, your father, the impossible situation you faced, the choice you made to withdraw from school and take care of them." She felt tears forming but forced herself to continue. "What you did was extraordinary, Joseph. You sacrificed your dreams to save your family. That required a kind of courage and selflessness that I cannot even imagine. And then you found a way to stay connected to music by working here, listening to performances, remaining part of this world even though you could not participate in the way you had hoped. That is remarkable." Joseph shook his head, a sad smile crossing his face. "You make it sound noble, but it was simply what had to be done. What choice did I have? Let my sister suffer without proper care, let my mother deteriorate without supervision. Let my father struggle alone with the burden of everything that had happened. They needed me, and I was able to help them. It is what family does. There is no special nobility in this, just basic human responsibility." "Many people would not have done it," Alina countered. "Many people would have found a way to rationalize continuing their studies, would have told themselves that they could help their family better in the long run by becoming successful first. You made the harder choice, the immediate sacrifice, without apparent hesitation. That matters." Joseph was quiet for another moment before responding. "Perhaps, or perhaps I was simply too young and too frightened to see any other option. I cannot know what I might have done if I had been older or wiser or braver. I only know what I did, and I have lived with that choice for 47 years. Most of the time, I am at peace with it. My sister lived a good life despite her disabilities. She married, had children, found happiness in her own way. My mother's final years were comfortable and safe. My father had 10 more years of life that he might not have had without proper care. These outcomes were possible because of the choices I made. When I think of it that way, the sacrifice seems less painful." "But you lost your chance to become the musician you might have been," Alina said softly. "You lost the opportunity to share your gifts with the world, to have the career you had worked so hard for. That loss is real, even if the reasons for it were justified." Joseph nodded slowly. "Yes, that loss is real. In the early years, it was very painful. I would hear music and feel such longing, such grief for what I could no longer do. I would dream about performing and then wake up to my reality and feel crushed all over again. But time changes these things. The pain faded to a dull ache, then to a kind of wistful nostalgia, and eventually to something like acceptance. I found other ways to have music in my life. Working here, I hear the greatest performers in the world. I know this building intimately, every hallway and room, every acoustic quirk. I am part of the machinery that makes these performances possible, even if my role is humble. There is satisfaction in that, in being useful, in contributing to something beautiful even from the shadows." Alina listened with growing admiration for this man, who had found a way to transform devastating loss into something approaching peace. "Do you still play?" she asked, "even privately, just for yourself?" Joseph shook his head. "Not for many years. In the beginning, I would occasionally find access to a piano, play a little, try to maintain some connection to what I had been. But it was too painful, and besides, my hands were changing. Manual labor does things to hands, makes them stiff and calloused, reduces their flexibility. And I had no time to practice seriously, just a few minutes here and there, which is not enough to maintain real skill. Eventually, I stopped trying. It seemed better to let that part of my past remain in the past, to not torture myself with reminders of abilities I was losing." His voice carried a matter-of-fact sadness, the tone of someone stating a difficult truth that had been accepted long ago. Alina felt her throat tighten with emotion. The thought of Joseph slowly losing his abilities through years of neglect and manual labor, his talented hands gradually forgetting the music they had once known, was almost unbearable. "But when you asked to play the other day," she said, "when you made that request, you must have been feeling something, some desire to touch a piano again. What made you ask after all these years?" Joseph smiled sadly. "I do not fully know. Perhaps it was seeing you, so confident and accomplished, preparing to do what I once dreamed of doing. Perhaps it was simply an old man's foolishness, a moment of nostalgia. I had heard about your performance, knew the Rachmaninoff you would play, and I suppose I wanted to feel some connection to that world again, even for just a few minutes. It was a silly impulse. I should not have bothered you with it. It was not silly, Alina insisted, her voice intense with emotion. It was completely understandable, and I should have recognized that. Instead, I was dismissive and cruel. I am so deeply sorry, Joseph. You deserved so much better, both from me and from life in general. What happened to you was profoundly unfair. She paused, then continued with sudden determination. Would you play for me now? Not on the concert grand, I understand that's not possible today, but sometime soon. I would be honored to hear you, to witness whatever remains of your abilities after all these years. Please, Joseph. Let me try to make amends for my behavior, by giving you the respect and attention I should have offered from the beginning. Joseph looked startled by the request, his eyes widening in surprise. He immediately began shaking his head. No, Miss Marchesi, you do not understand. I have not seriously played in 47 years. My fingers are stiff, my hands damaged by arthritis and manual labor. Whatever ability I once had is long gone. I would embarrass myself and disappoint you. It is better to leave this in the past where it belongs. But Alina would not be dissuaded. I don't care if you make mistakes or if your technique is not what it once was. I want to hear you play because you deserve the dignity of being heard, because your musical voice matters regardless of whether it meets professional standards. Please, Joseph, do this for yourself if not for me. When did you last allow yourself to touch a piano, to feel those keys under your fingers, to express yourself through music? You have spent 47 years caring for others and working humbly. Perhaps it is time to do something for yourself. Joseph was clearly torn, his expression cycling between longing and fear. I do not know if I even remember how to play anymore, he said quietly. It has been so long. And even if I remember, my body may not be able to execute what my mind recalls. It could be terribly frustrating and sad. Or it could be liberating and healing, Alina countered gently. You won't know unless you try. And I promise you, I will not judge you or compare you to professional standards. I simply want to hear whatever you have to offer, to bear witness to the musical spirit that still lives within you despite everything you have endured. The silence stretched between them as Joseph wrestled with the decision. Alina could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered face, decades of protective habits warring with a deep longing that had never entirely died. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Joseph gave a small nod. Perhaps, he said slowly, if you truly wish it, I could try to play something. Not here, not now. I would need time to prepare myself mentally. And it would have to be private when the building is empty. I could not bear to have others hear me struggle. He paused, then added, there is a practice room piano on the 4th floor, nothing special but adequate. The building is closed on Sundays except for emergencies. If you could arrange access, I might be willing to try then. But I warn you, you will likely be disappointed. Alina felt a surge of gratitude and excitement that surprised her with its intensity. Sunday is perfect. I will arrange everything with the building management. What time works for you? Joseph considered. Morning would be best, perhaps 10 o'clock. The building will be quietest then. 10 o'clock Sunday morning, Alina confirmed, pulling out her phone to note it. I will meet you at the employee entrance. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for giving me this chance to witness your music and to begin to make amends for my behavior. She reached across the table and took his hand, weathered and scarred from decades of manual labor, and squeezed it gently. Joseph looked surprised by the physical contact but did not pull away. They talked for a few more minutes, their conversation becoming easier as the initial awkwardness faded. Joseph asked about Alina's own musical education and career, and she answered his questions while being careful not to dominate the conversation or make it about herself. She wanted to honor Joseph's story and experience, not overshadow it with her own comparisons. Eventually, Joseph noted that he needed to return to his work, and they both stood. As they walked back toward the corridor where Alina had found him, Joseph spoke once more. You should know, Miss Marchesi, that your playing the other night was truly remarkable. Whatever else has passed between us, that fact remains. You have a great gift, and you use it well. Do not let this situation with me diminish your own achievements or confidence. Alina felt tears forming again at this generous statement from a man she had wronged. Thank you, Joseph. That means more than you know, especially coming from someone who understands the music as deeply as you do. They parted at the ladder where she had found him, and Alina made her way out of the building, her heart full of complex emotions. Lingering shame for her behavior, profound respect for Joseph's sacrifice and dignity, and nervous anticipation for Sunday morning when she would finally hear the music of Joseph Kellerman. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of clear, crisp autumn weather that makes Vienna particularly beautiful. The air sharp and clean, the light slanting through buildings with golden intensity. Alina woke early despite having slept poorly again, her anticipation and nervousness preventing truly restful sleep. She dressed carefully in comfortable casual clothes, choosing soft blacks and grays that felt appropriate for what promised to be a solemn and emotionally charged occasion. She took a taxi to the Staatsoper, arriving 15 minutes early, and waited outside the employee entrance as they had arranged. Joseph appeared exactly at 10 o'clock, walking up the street from the direction of the U-Bahn station. He wore civilian clothes rather than his work uniform, pressed slacks, a button-down shirt, and a somewhat worn but respectable sport coat. He carried a leather folder that looked old and well-used, and his expression was one of barely controlled anxiety mixed with determination. When he saw Alina, he gave a small nod of greeting but did not smile, his tension palpable even from a distance. "Good morning," Alina said warmly as he approached. "Thank you for coming. Are you ready?" Joseph gave a short, nervous laugh. "I am not at all ready, but I am here, which is perhaps the same thing." He had arranged for building access through his supervisor, explaining that he needed to retrieve some personal items and do an inventory check, white lies that the supervisor had accepted without question. They entered through the employee door and made their way through the familiar backstage corridors, now eerily quiet and empty, without the usual bustle of rehearsals and performances. The practice room on the fourth floor was small and windowless, lit by overhead fluorescent lights that gave everything a slightly harsh clinical quality. An upright piano sat against one wall, nothing special but well-maintained, its dark wood showing the scratches and wear of decades of use by countless students and performers. A bench sat before it, and two mismatched chairs occupied the opposite wall. Alina entered the room with Joseph following, and for a moment they both simply stood there, staring at the piano as though it were something dangerous or sacred. "I have not played in front of anyone since 1978, Joseph said quietly, his voice slightly shaky. "The last time was a student recital in March, just weeks before my sister's accident. I played Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major and a Chopin ballade. I received positive feedback from my teachers. It was a good performance, one I was proud of. I have thought about that recital many times over the years, the last moment when I was still the person I had been trying to become." Alina felt her throat tighten at the poignant image of young Joseph having his final public performance, without knowing it would be his last. "Whatever you play today will be for your own sake, not for judgment or evaluation. Please try to let go of any anxiety about how it sounds. This is about reconnecting with a part of yourself that you were forced to set aside." Joseph nodded but did not look convinced. He walked slowly to the bench and sat down, his movements deliberate and careful. He stared at the keys for a long moment without touching them, his hands hovering above the keyboard as though approaching something that might burn. Finally, with visible effort, he placed his fingers on the keys in the shape of a C major chord. The simple contact seemed to cause him physical pain, and Alina saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes. "The keys feel foreign now," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. "My hands remember something, but the connection feels broken, like trying to speak a language you once knew fluently but have not used in half a lifetime." Despite his words, he began to play simple scales, starting with C major and progressing through other keys. His fingers were stiff and uncertain, the scales uneven and halting. Alina could hear the struggle in every note, the gap between intention and execution that must have been agonizing for someone who had once played with skill and confidence. Joseph persisted through the scales, his brow furrowed in concentration, his jaw clenched with effort. Gradually, imperceptibly at first, his fingers began to find their way with slightly more certainty. The decades of muscle memory were not entirely gone, merely deeply buried, and they were beginning to surface like artifacts from an archaeological dig. After perhaps 10 minutes of scales and simple exercises, Joseph paused, flexing his hands and rolling his shoulders, trying to release tension that was hindering his movement. "I brought some sheet music," he said, reaching for the leather folder he had set on the floor beside the bench. "These are pieces I once knew well, though I have not looked at them in years. I am not sure I can even read music fluently anymore." He opened the folder with trembling hands, revealing pages yellowed with age, covered in pencil markings and annotations in a younger person's handwriting, a historical record of hours spent in practice rooms not unlike this one, working through passages and making notes about interpretation and technique. He selected a piece of music and placed it on the piano's music stand, smoothing the pages with gentle, almost reverent touches. "Chopin," he said simply, "Nocturne in C-sharp minor, opus post. It is not among the most famous nocturnes, but I always loved it. There is a sadness to it, but also a kind of acceptance, a peaceful melancholy. It feels appropriate for this moment." While Joseph positioned his hands over the keys again, and after a moment of silent preparation, he began to play. The opening measures were hesitant, his fingers searching for the right notes, his timing uneven. Wrong notes appeared frequently, and his hands occasionally got tangled or froze completely, requiring him to stop and restart. It was, by any objective measure, an imperfect performance, riddled with technical flaws that would have been unacceptable in even a moderately advanced student. But as Joseph continued, something extraordinary began to happen. Despite the wrong notes and awkward transitions, despite the stiffness of fingers not accustomed to such delicate work, the essential spirit of the music began to emerge. The nocturne's melancholic beauty, its tender sadness and gentle acceptance, flowed from the piano in a way that transcended technical perfection. Joseph was not simply playing notes on a page. He was channeling 47 years of lived experience, of loss and sacrifice and quiet dignity, into Chopin's music. Every phrase carried weight, every melody line spoke of genuine emotion earned through real suffering and real survival. Alina sat in one of the chairs along the wall, watching and listening with complete focus. Tears began streaming down her face as she witnessed this remarkable moment, this resurrection of a musical voice that had been silenced for nearly 5 decades. She thought about all the concerts she had attended, all the technically flawless performances by skilled professionals, and realized that many of them had lacked what Joseph was demonstrating now. Absolute emotional authenticity. Music played not for applause or career advancement, but simply because it needed to be expressed, because the human soul speaking through the notes demanded to be heard. Joseph played through to the end of the nocturne, the final measures dissolving into silence that felt sacred and profound. His hands remained on the keys for a long moment before slowly dropping to his lap. He sat motionless, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking slightly. Alina realized he was crying, silent tears falling onto his lap, his body racked with emotions that he had apparently held back for decades and was only now allowing to surface. She waited, giving him space to experience whatever he was feeling without interference. The room was utterly quiet except for Joseph's occasional sharp intake of breath as he struggled to compose himself. Finally, after several minutes, he wiped at his face with his sleeve and turned slightly on the bench to look at Alina. "I am sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I did not expect such emotion. It has been so long since I allowed myself to feel these things. Playing again, even so poorly, it has opened something inside me that I thought I had sealed away forever." Alina shook her head, her own face wet with tears. "Please do not apologize. What you just played was one of the most beautiful and moving things I have ever heard. I mean that sincerely, Joseph. The technical imperfections do not matter. What matters is the depth of feeling, the honesty of expression. You have a musical voice that deserves to be heard, regardless of whether your fingers can execute perfectly anymore." Joseph gave a sad, incredulous laugh. "You are very kind, but I know what I heard. So many wrong notes, so much stiffness and hesitation. This is not what music should sound like." "Music should sound like truth," Alina countered firmly. "And what you just played was profoundly true. I have heard hundreds of flawless performances that said far less than your imperfect Chopin just did. You played with your whole life behind you, with all your experiences and losses and survivals. That is what makes music matter, Joseph. Not just technical perfection, but human truth expressed through sound." They sat in silence for another moment, both recovering from the emotional intensity of what had just occurred. Then Joseph, with visible effort, turned back to the piano. "I would like to play something else," he said quietly. "If you are willing to listen, I feel something opening inside me, something that has been locked away for too long. I need to let it out." "I will listen for as long as you want to play," Alina assured him. Joseph selected another piece from his folder, a Schubert impromptu in G-flat major, the same piece he had mentioned playing at his final student recital in 1978. This time, as he played, his fingers moved with slightly more confidence, the decades of muscle memory surfacing more readily. The piece was still imperfect, still marked by occasional wrong notes and momentary freezes, but the improvement from the Chopin was noticeable. His hands were remembering, his body was reclaiming abilities it had thought lost. Alina listened in wonder, realizing she was witnessing something rare and precious. A musician reconnecting with a fundamental part of himself after nearly half a century of separation. It was like watching someone remember how to speak their native language after years of forced silence, or watching someone rediscover the ability to walk after a long paralysis. The music was not just sound. It was evidence of the human spirit's remarkable resilience, proof that essential parts of ourselves can survive even the most devastating losses and longest absences. When Joseph finished the Schubert, he immediately began another piece, then another, working through his folder of old sheet music with growing confidence and decreasing hesitation. He played for nearly 2 hours straight, pausing only briefly between pieces to flex his hands or wipe tears from his eyes. Alina remained in her chair the entire time, bearing witness to this extraordinary reclamation of lost identity, feeling privileged beyond measure to be present for such a profound personal moment. Finally, when Joseph's hands were clearly too tired to continue, his fingers stiff and aching from unaccustomed use, he stopped and sat quietly at the piano, his hands resting in his lap, his breathing deep and slow. Alina could see exhaustion in his posture, but also something that might have been peace or perhaps completion, as though he had finally done something that needed to be done for far too long. "Thank you," Joseph said without turning around. "Thank you for insisting on this, for giving me permission to do what I had forbidden myself for so many years. I did not realize how much I needed this until it was happening. Something inside me feels different now, lighter somehow, as though a burden I did not fully recognize has been lifted." Alina stood and walked over to the piano, placing her hand gently on Joseph's shoulder. "Thank you for trusting me enough to share this. What you have given me today is a gift beyond measure. You have reminded me of something I had forgotten or perhaps never fully understood. That music is not about perfection or professional achievement. It is about human expression, about the need we all have to communicate what cannot be said in words. You have that gift, Joseph, and you always will, regardless of whether your technical abilities are what they once were." They stood together in silence for a long moment, musician and musician, human and human, connected by the profound experience they had just shared. The empty practice room, with its harsh fluorescent lighting and worn upright piano, had become the site of something sacred. A moment when lost possibilities had been partially reclaimed and old wounds had begun, however tentatively, to heal. The walk back through the empty opera house corridors felt different than the approach had been. Joseph moved with less tension in his shoulders, his step slightly lighter, though his face showed the exhaustion of someone who had just completed a marathon of emotional and physical exertion. Alina walked beside him in companionable silence, both of them processing what had just occurred, neither quite ready to speak about it yet. They emerged into the bright autumn sunlight outside the employee entrance, and Joseph locked the door behind them with the key his supervisor had provided. He turned to Alina, his expression complex and difficult to read, layers of emotion shifting beneath the surface. "I should go home now," he said quietly. "My body is exhausted and I need time alone to think about what has happened this morning. But perhaps we could speak again soon. I find that I have many thoughts and feelings that I would like to share if you are willing to listen." "I would like that very much," Alina replied. "Would you be comfortable meeting for coffee? There is a cafe not far from here, a quiet place where we could talk without interruption." Joseph nodded his agreement, and they arranged to meet the following afternoon, a Monday when Alina had no scheduled commitments and Joseph had a day off from his work at the opera house. They parted ways on the street, Joseph heading toward the U-Bahn station and Alina deciding to walk for a while, needing movement and fresh air to process her own swirling thoughts and emotions. The experience of hearing Joseph play had affected her more profoundly than she had anticipated. She had expected to be moved by the poignancy of the situation, by the narrative of lost potential partially reclaimed. But what she had actually experienced went deeper than that. Joseph's imperfect, heartfelt playing had revealed something to her about the nature of musical expression that challenged assumptions she had held throughout her career. Alina had spent decades pursuing technical perfection, believing that mastery of her instrument was the highest goal a pianist could achieve. She had practiced relentlessly to eliminate wrong notes, to achieve evenness of tone and precision of rhythm, to develop the stamina and control required for the most demanding repertoire. These skills had brought her professional success and critical acclaim, and she had never seriously questioned whether they represented the ultimate purpose of musical study. But listening to Joseph, she had heard something that her own playing sometimes lacked. Absolute emotional transparency, music stripped of any performative artifice or concern for how it might be received. Joseph had nothing to prove and no career to protect. He was simply allowing himself to express what lived inside him through the medium of sound. And the result had been profoundly moving in a way that technically perfect performances sometimes were not. As Alina walked through Vienna's beautiful streets, past historic buildings and elegant shops, she found herself questioning the trajectory of her own career. When had she last played purely for herself, with no thought of audiences or critics or recording contracts? When had she allowed herself to be vulnerable through her music rather than displaying her mastery? These questions unsettled her, suggesting that perhaps success had come at a cost she had not fully recognized. The following afternoon, Alina arrived early at the cafe they had agreed upon. a small, traditional Viennese establishment with marble-top tables, bentwood chairs, and an atmosphere of quiet elegance. She ordered a mélange and waited, watching the door anxiously, half afraid that Joseph might change his mind and not appear. But exactly at the appointed time, he walked through the door, again wearing civilian clothes and looking nervous but determined. He spotted Alina and made his way to her table, and they exchanged greetings before he ordered a coffee from the attentive waiter. For a few moments they engaged in superficial pleasantries, commenting on the weather and the cafe's atmosphere, both clearly gathering courage to dive into deeper conversation. Finally, Joseph took a breath and began to speak in earnest. "I have been thinking about yesterday constantly," he said, his accented English careful and precise. "I hardly slept last night, my mind so full of memories and emotions that I could not quiet it. Playing again after all these years, it was like opening a door I had locked and sealed and tried to forget existed. Behind that door was a version of myself I thought I had lost forever, and discovering he still exists in some form, even diminished, has shaken my understanding of my own life." Alina listened intently, grateful that Joseph was willing to share his inner experience. "How do you feel about that discovery? Is it painful or healing or both?" Joseph considered the question carefully. "Both, certainly. There is pain in being reminded of what I gave up, of the person I might have become if circumstances had been different. When I was playing yesterday, part of my mind kept thinking about the young man I was, so full of ambition and confidence, and mourning the loss of that future. But there is also something healing in realizing that the essential love of music never died inside me, that despite 47 years of separation from regular playing, the ability to express myself through sound still exists, however imperfectly." He paused to sip his coffee before continuing. "I think I had convinced myself over the years that my musical identity was entirely tied to the possibility of a professional career, that if I could not be a concert pianist, then that part of me was dead and gone. But yesterday showed me that was not true. The music lives in me regardless of whether I perform for audiences or achieve professional recognition. I can still connect with composers through their scores, still feel the profound joy of expressing emotion through harmonic language and melodic line. That realization feels like recovering something precious that I thought had been stolen forever." Alina felt tears pricking at her eyes again, moved by Joseph's articulate processing of such complex emotions. "I am so grateful that you were willing to take the risk of playing again, even though it was frightening and difficult. What you discovered about yourself is beautiful and important." Joseph smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed his usually guarded face. "I am grateful to you for insisting upon it. If you had not apologized and then pushed me to play despite my resistance, I would have continued believing my musical self was entirely in the past. You gave me a gift yesterday, Miss Marchesi, perhaps without fully realizing it." "Please call me Alina," she said. "After what we have shared, formality seems unnecessary." "Alina then," Joseph said, testing the name. "It is a beautiful name." They talked for nearly 3 hours that afternoon, their conversation ranging across many topics. Joseph shared more stories from his youth, his years at the conservatory, his relationship with his teachers and fellow students. He spoke with surprising lack of bitterness about the way his life had unfolded, though he admitted there had been years, particularly in his 30s and 40s, when anger and resentment had been constant companions. "I had to make a conscious choice to let go of those feelings," he explained. "They were poisoning my life, making me unable to find any joy or satisfaction in my circumstances. I decided, with the help of a counselor I saw for a time, that I could either spend my life mourning what I had lost, or I could try to find meaning and purpose in what I actually had. It was not easy, and I cannot claim to have entirely succeeded, but I tried." Alina, in turn, found herself opening up about aspects of her own experience that she rarely discussed with anyone. She confessed that despite her professional success, she often felt isolated and disconnected from normal human relationships. The demands of her career, the constant travel and practice and performance, left little room for deep friendships or romantic relationships. She admitted that she sometimes felt like a performing machine, valued only for her ability to execute difficult repertoire, with little recognition of her humanity beyond her musical utility. "There is a loneliness to being perpetually on display," she said quietly. "People see the pianist, the celebrity, the successful artist, but they rarely see me as simply Alina, a person with doubts and fears and needs like anyone else. I have become so practiced at maintaining a professional persona that I sometimes wonder if I even know who I am underneath it anymore." Joseph listened with evident compassion. "It seems we have both paid prices for our relationships with music, though in very different ways. I was forced to abandon mine and have lived with that loss. You have achieved yours and discovered that success brings its own kind of suffering. Perhaps this is simply the nature of dedicating oneself to art, that there is always a cost, and we can only hope that what we gain is worth what we sacrifice. This perspective, coming from someone who had sacrificed so much, gave Alina pause. She had never thought of her own struggles as comparable to Joseph's, but he was suggesting that different forms of devotion to music all required surrender of something, that there was no path through the life of serious musicianship that did not demand something difficult in return for its rewards. As their conversation continued, Alina found herself sharing thoughts she had never articulated before. Feelings about the pressure to constantly improve, to maintain her position in the competitive world of concert performance, to meet the expectations of audiences and critics and orchestra management. She spoke about performances that had gone wrong despite her best preparation, about reviews that had stung despite her attempts to remain professionally detached, about the creeping fear that her abilities might be declining as she approached 40, that younger pianists with flashier techniques might make her obsolete. Joseph listened to all of this with careful attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just being present for Alina's confession of vulnerability. When she finally finished, somewhat embarrassed by how much she had revealed, he spoke with gentle wisdom. "It seems to me that you have forgotten something important, Alina. You play music not to serve critics or audiences or your career, but because you have something to express that can only be said through sound. Yesterday, when I played for you, I was not thinking about technical perfection or professional standards. I was simply allowing myself to feel and express through the medium of music. That is the essence of artistry, I believe. Everything else, all the business and competition and professional advancement, those are necessary parts of a career, but they are not the core purpose of making music." His words struck Alina with unexpected force. She realized that somewhere along the path of her professional development, she had indeed lost sight of this fundamental truth. Music had become primarily about achievement and recognition rather than expression and communication. The joy that had drawn her to the piano as a child had been buried under layers of career concerns and professional obligations. "How do I find my way back to that?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "How do I reconnect with the simple love of music when so much else has accumulated around it?" Joseph smiled gently. "I cannot answer that for you, but I suspect it has something to do with allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to play sometimes without concern for how it will be received. Perhaps you need to play for yourself or for one trusted person with no pressure to be perfect or impressive. Perhaps you need to remember that you are human first and musician second, and that your value as a person is not dependent on your abilities at the keyboard." They sat in silence for a moment, both recognizing the profound exchange that had just occurred. Alina felt simultaneously exposed and liberated, as though Joseph had helped her see a truth she had been avoiding, and while the seeing was uncomfortable, it was also necessary and ultimately freeing. As the afternoon stretched into early evening and the cafe began to fill with the dinner crowd, they finally prepared to part ways. But before they did, Alina made a decision. "Joseph, I want to do something for you. Not out of pity or obligation, but because I believe you deserve recognition for what you gave up and for the musician you still are, despite everything. Would you be willing to perform a short recital at the Staatsoper? Nothing public, nothing commercial, just a small gathering of people who would appreciate hearing you play. Orchestra members, staff, perhaps some students from the conservatory. I could arrange everything, and you would have complete control over the program and the setting." Joseph looked startled, then frightened, then thoughtful. "I do not know, Alina. The idea of performing for others, even a small group, terrifies me. What if I fail completely? What if my hands cannot execute what I intend? I would humiliate myself." "You would not humiliate yourself," Alina insisted. "Anyone who understands your story would be honored to hear you play, regardless of technical perfection. And I think it would complete something for you, give you the opportunity you were denied in 1978, even if in a much different form than originally planned. You deserve to have people bear witness to your musicianship, to be acknowledged as the artist you are and always have been." Joseph remained uncertain, but Alina could see the longing in his eyes, the part of him that wanted to say yes despite his fears. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "This is not a decision I can make quickly. It feels too important, too frightening. Give me some time to consider." "Of course," Alina agreed. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands whenever you are ready, if you ever decide you want to do it." They parted outside the cafe with a warmth and mutual respect that felt remarkable given how their relationship had begun. Alina walked back to her hotel feeling more emotionally exhausted than she ever had after a full concert, but also strangely energized. as though something important was beginning to shift in her understanding of herself and her relationship to music. She realized that Joseph had become more than just a person she had wronged and was trying to make amends to. He had become a teacher, showing her truths about music and life that her formal education had never addressed. 3 weeks passed before Joseph contacted Alina again. She had returned to her regular performance schedule, traveling to Berlin for a recital, then to London for a concerto appearance, all the while thinking frequently about the elderly janitor and the profound conversations they had shared. She wondered if he would ever feel comfortable with the idea of performing, or if she had pushed too hard with a suggestion that had ultimately caused more anxiety than benefit. Then, on a Tuesday morning while Alina was in her Milan apartment between engagements, her phone rang with a Vienna number she didn't recognize. When she answered, Joseph's tentative voice came through the line. "Alina, this is Joseph Kellerman. I hope I am not disturbing you. I have been thinking about your offer and I believe I would like to accept if it is still possible." Alina felt a surge of joy and immediately assured him that the offer absolutely still stood. They talked for over an hour, with Joseph explaining that he had spent the weeks practicing every day in the early mornings before his work shift, using the same practice room piano where he had played for Alina. His hands were gradually remembering, his fingers developing strength and flexibility they had lost over the decades. He would never regain his youthful technique, he emphasized, but he had improved significantly from that first Sunday morning, and he felt ready to share his music with a small, sympathetic audience. Alina immediately set to work making arrangements. She contacted the management of the Staatsoper and proposed an unusual afternoon event, explaining enough of Joseph's story to secure their cooperation and enthusiasm. She personally invited orchestra members, emphasizing that this would be a private, meaningful occasion rather than a standard performance. She reached out to the Vienna Conservatory and arranged for a select group of scholarship students to attend, feeling that they in particular should witness what happened when financial hardship and family obligations threatened to derail musical careers. Greta, the elderly violinist who had first told Alina about Joseph's past, helped spread the word among the venue's staff, many of whom had worked alongside Joseph for years without knowing his history. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with people expressing eagerness to attend and gratitude that someone was finally acknowledging what Joseph had sacrificed and endured. The event was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon 4 weeks later, giving Joseph time to prepare a program and practice to the point where he felt reasonably comfortable. Alina offered to coach him if he wanted technical advice, but Joseph declined, explaining that he needed to do this on his own terms, to present himself as he actually was rather than as a polished version created for public consumption. Alina understood and respected this decision, recognizing that authenticity mattered more than technical perfection for what this event represented. The Sunday of Joseph's recital arrived with gray skies and cold rain, whether that felt appropriately solemn and serious. Alina arrived at the Staatsoper early to help with final arrangements, working with the technical staff to set up chairs in one of the smaller rehearsal halls rather than the main stage. They agreed this would feel more intimate and less intimidating than the vast concert hall where Alina herself had performed. About 80 chairs were arranged in a semicircle around a beautiful Steinway grand piano that had been moved in specifically for the occasion. By 2 o'clock, when the event was scheduled to begin, approximately 60 people had gathered, filling most of the chairs and creating an atmosphere of hushed anticipation. Alina saw Greta sitting in the front row alongside other orchestra members. Several staff members from various departments had come, including the maintenance supervisor who had employed Joseph for decades. A group of about 15 conservatory students sat together, young faces full of curiosity. And scattered throughout were other musicians, administrators, and friends who had heard about the event and wanted to be present. Joseph arrived looking terrified, his face pale and his hands trembling visibly as Alina met him at the door. He wore a dark suit that looked borrowed or purchased secondhand but fit him reasonably well, and he carried his leather folder of sheet music like a lifeline. Alina took him aside for a moment of private conversation, holding his hands and looking directly into his anxious eyes. "You can do this, Joseph. Everyone here understands your story and wants only to support you. There is no judgment, no criticism, only appreciation for your courage and gratitude that you are sharing something precious with us. Just play from your heart, as you did for me that first Sunday morning, and everything will be perfect exactly as it is." Joseph nodded, taking deep breaths to steady himself. "I keep thinking about that young man in 1978 who was preparing to perform the Hammerklavier, how confident he felt, how certain of his abilities. I wish I could feel even a fraction of that confidence now. You have something now that young man did not have, Alina said firmly. You have depth of life experience, understanding of loss and sacrifice and survival. That comes through in your music in ways that youthful confidence never could. Trust in that, Joseph. Trust in who you are now, not who you were then. They walked together into the rehearsal hall, and the conversation immediately hushed as people turned to see them enter. Alina guided Joseph to the front of the room, where she had set up a simple music stand with a microphone. She had asked Joseph if he wanted her to introduce him, and he had gratefully accepted, knowing he would not be able to speak coherently about himself in such an emotionally charged moment. Alina stood before the assembled group, her own emotions barely under control, and began to speak. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. What you are about to witness is something rare and precious. The reclamation of a musical voice that was silenced nearly half a century ago by circumstances of tragic misfortune and noble sacrifice. The man you see before you, Joseph Kellerman, was once a promising piano student at the Vienna Conservatory, praised by his teachers and predicted to have a significant concert career. In 1978, just months before his graduation recital, family tragedy forced him to withdraw from his studies and abandon his musical aspirations to care for his sister, mother, and father. Alina paused, noticing that many in the audience were already showing emotion, and several of the older staff members were nodding as though confirming a story they had partly known. She continued, her voice growing stronger. Joseph made the hardest choice imaginable, sacrificing his dreams so that his family could survive and eventually heal. He then spent the next 47 years working here at this opera house in a custodial role, remaining connected to the music he loved even though he could no longer actively participate as a performer. What you will hear today is not a polished professional performance. Joseph's technique has been diminished by decades away from regular practice and by the physical toll of manual labor. But what you will hear is something equally valuable and perhaps more important. Music played with absolute honesty and emotional truth, by a person who understands both the transcendent power of art and the complex costs of living a fully human life. She turned to look at Joseph, who stood with tears already running down his face, and continued, "It is my profound honor to introduce Joseph Kellerman, who will now share his music with us. I ask that you listen not with the ears of critics evaluating technique, but with the hearts of fellow human beings witnessing an act of courage and reclamation. Joseph, the piano is yours." The room erupted in applause, warm and sustained, as Alina stepped aside and Joseph made his way to the piano bench. He sat down carefully, placed his folder on the music stand, and took several long breaths before positioning his hands over the keys. The audience settled into expectant silence, and for a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Joseph simply sat motionless, gathering his courage. Then he began to play. His first piece was the Chopin Nocturne in C-sharp minor that he had played for Alina that first private morning. The opening measures were tentative, his nervousness evident in the slight tremor of his hands, but as he continued, the same remarkable thing that had happened before occurred again. The music took over, and Joseph's anxiety receded as he lost himself in expression. Yes, there were wrong notes and moments of hesitation, but there was also profound beauty, genuine feeling, a lifetime of experience channeled through Chopin's language of longing and acceptance. The audience listened with absolute attention, many openly weeping as they heard this man who had served them quietly for decades, finally revealing a hidden dimension of himself. When the nocturne ended, there was a moment of silence before applause began, restrained but deeply felt, allowing Joseph a moment to collect himself before continuing. He played 5 more pieces over the next 40 minutes. The Schubert Impromptu in G-flat major, a gentle Brahms intermezzo, a Bach prelude and fugue that showed his solid technical training despite the years away. And finally, as his closing work, the slow movement from Beethoven's Pathétique Sonata. This last piece, one of the most beloved in the piano repertoire, carried such weight of lived emotion in Joseph's hands that barely a dry eye remained in the room by the time the final chord faded into silence. Joseph sat at the piano for a long moment after finishing, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Then the audience rose as one, applauding with an intensity and sincerity that clearly overwhelmed him. People were calling out words of appreciation and support, and the sound grew until it filled the room with affirmation and recognition. Joseph finally stood and turned to face the audience, and his face, though streaked with tears, showed something that might have been joy or peace or perhaps simply the relief of finally being seen and acknowledged for who he truly was. Alina walked to the piano and stood beside Joseph, taking his hand in hers. "Thank you," she said simply, speaking into the microphone so everyone could hear. "Thank you for your courage, for your music, and for reminding all of us what truly matters in art and in life." She turned to the audience. I have one more surprise for Joseph and for you. I have prepared a short duet, a simple four-hand arrangement of a Schubert song, and if Joseph is willing, we will perform it together now." Joseph looked surprised but nodded agreement, and Alina retrieved sheet music from her bag. They sat side by side at the piano bench, professional concert pianist and elderly janitor, and played together a gentle, lyrical arrangement of Schubert's and Die Musik to music. Their playing blended together naturally, Alina's polished technique supporting Joseph's more fragile but emotionally direct approach, creating something that transcended what either could have produced alone. It was a perfect metaphor for what their unlikely friendship had become. A partnership that honored both mastery and authenticity, success and sacrifice, technical achievement and human truth. When they finished, the applause was even more enthusiastic than before, and people began coming forward to congratulate Joseph personally. He was embraced by colleagues who had worked beside him for years, thanked tearfully by conservatory students who were inspired by his story, and praised by orchestra musicians who recognized a fellow artist regardless of his official role. Alina stepped back and watched this outpouring of recognition and affection, feeling that something important and right was happening. A small correction of the injustice that had derailed Joseph's life so many years ago. The reception that followed in an adjoining room was warm and emotional, with people clustering around Joseph to hear more of his story and express their appreciation. Greta pulled Alina aside at one point and said simply, "Thank you for doing this. Joseph has been invisible for too long. Today he was finally seen." Alina nodded, too full of emotion to respond adequately. In the weeks and months that followed, Alina took further action to honor Joseph and address the issues his story represented. She established the Joseph Kellerman Scholarship Fund at the Vienna Conservatory, endowing it with a significant portion of her own savings and actively fundraising from other musicians and patrons. The scholarship was specifically designed to support talented students facing financial hardship or family obligations that threaten their ability to complete their studies, providing not just tuition assistance, but also funding for family support services, counseling, and emergency financial aid. At the fund's public announcement, Alina spoke about the need to recognize that musical talent exists across all economic circumstances, and that supporting young musicians sometimes means supporting their families as well. "We cannot know how many Joseph Kellermans exist in the world," she said. "How many talented people have been forced to abandon their artistic aspirations because they lacked adequate support systems. This scholarship cannot change the past, but perhaps it can prevent some future losses." Alina also made a personal commitment to visit Joseph regularly when her schedule allowed. They established a routine of Sunday morning meetings in practice rooms at the Staatsoper, where they would play together for hours, sometimes working on duet repertoire, sometimes simply exploring music for their own enjoyment. These sessions became deeply important to Alina, reminders of why she had been drawn to music in the first place, opportunities to play without pressure or professional stakes, simply for the joy of expression and connection. Joseph, for his part, seemed transformed by the experience of his recital and the recognition it had brought. He continued working at the opera house, but colleagues noticed a new lightness in his demeanor, a piece that suggested some long-carried burden had been set down. He began attending more performances from audience seats rather than standing in the back, accepting offers from orchestra members who wanted to give him complimentary tickets. He even began teaching, informally, offering guidance to a few conservatory students who sought him out after hearing about his story and his recital. Several months after Joseph's recital, Alina was scheduled for another major performance at the Staatsoper, this time performing Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23 with the Vienna Symphony. The concert was sold out, as her performances in Vienna had become since word spread about her role in Joseph's story and the scholarship fund she had established. On the night of the concert, as Alina stood in the wings preparing to walk onto the stage, she felt different than she had before previous performances. The nervousness was still present, but it was balanced by a deeper sense of purpose and connection to something larger than her own career. She walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause and took her seat at the piano, but before beginning, she did something unusual. She stood and addressed the audience directly, her voice clear and carrying through the hall without amplification. "Before we begin tonight, I want to dedicate this performance to a friend who has taught me more about music and life than I could have imagined possible. Joseph Kellerman, who many of you now know, is here tonight, and I want to acknowledge him and thank him for the gifts he has given me and this community." The audience applauded, and Alina could see Joseph in a good seat near the front, his face showing surprise and emotion. She continued, "Tonight's encore, which I will play regardless of whether you request it, will be Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, the piece Joseph played at his recital and the first piece I heard him perform. When I play it, I will be thinking about sacrifice and survival, about dreams deferred and identities reclaimed, and about the profound truth that we are all more than our careers or our circumstances allow us to show. We are all artists in our souls, regardless of whether the world recognizes us as such. Alina then sat and began the Mozart concerto, and she played it with a depth of feeling and communicative power that surprised even her. The technical execution was flawless, as always, but something additional was present. A vulnerability and human warmth that made the music feel like a direct communication from her heart to the hearts of the listeners. The second movement, with its profound simplicity and emotion, brought tears to many eyes, and the final movement sparkled with joy that felt genuine rather than merely professionally executed. When the concerto concluded to thunderous applause, Alina performed her promised encore. She spoke briefly to the audience, explaining, "This is how Joseph played it for me, with imperfections but with absolute truth. I cannot replicate that exactly, but I can honor it by playing with the same intention, to communicate feeling rather than to display technique." Then she played Chopin's Nocturne, and while her execution was technically superior to Joseph's, she managed to channel something of the emotional honesty she had witnessed, allowing herself to be vulnerable and expressive in ways she rarely permitted in public performance. As the final notes faded, Alina looked toward where Joseph sat, and their eyes met across the distance. In that moment, both understood that they had given each other something irreplaceable. Joseph had received acknowledgement and closure, the opportunity to be seen as the musician he had always been despite his circumstances. Alina had received a renewed understanding of what music was for, why it mattered beyond career success and critical acclaim. They had become unexpected teachers for each other, unlikely friends whose connection had transformed both their lives in fundamental ways. The story of the concert pianist and the janitor spread beyond Vienna, picked up by arts journalists, and eventually by mainstream media outlets drawn to its powerful narrative of loss, sacrifice, and redemption. The Joseph Kellerman Scholarship Fund received donations from around the world, eventually growing large enough to support multiple students each year. Joseph himself became a minor celebrity, occasionally interviewed about his experiences and his perspective on art and life, though he remained characteristically humble about the attention. But perhaps the most important legacy of their unlikely friendship was the change it worked in Alina's approach to her art and her life. She continued to perform at the highest professional levels, her technique and interpretive abilities undiminished. But she also began to speak more openly about the pressures and isolation of concert life, becoming an advocate for musicians' mental health and for a more humane approach to professional music education. She played more chamber music and collaborative concerts, finding joy in musical partnership that she had neglected during her single-minded pursuit of solo career success. And every Sunday morning that she was in Vienna, Alina and Joseph met in their practice room and played together. Two musicians sharing music not for applause or recognition, but simply because it needed to be expressed, because the human need to communicate through sound transcended all differences of circumstance and achievement. In those quiet hours, surrounded by nothing but each other's presence and the voice of the piano, they had found something that both had been missing: authentic connection through art, music restored to its fundamental purpose as a language of the human heart. The concert hall of the Vienna Staatsoper continued to host the world's greatest musicians, its stage witnessing performances of technical brilliance and artistic achievement. But for those who knew the full story, the building now held an additional meaning. It was a place where Joseph Kellerman had worked humbly for decades, staying close to the art he loved despite being unable to practice it professionally. It was a place where Alina Marchesi had learned profound lessons about what truly mattered in music and in life. And it was a place where, in a small rehearsal hall one rainy Sunday afternoon, an elderly janitor had finally received the recognition he had been denied half a century earlier. His music heard and honored by those who understood that artistry lives in the soul regardless of circumstance, and that the truest performances often come from those who play not for acclaim, but simply because their hearts demand expression through sound. This was their story, the concert pianist and the janitor, two lives intersecting in unexpected ways, each teaching the other, each transformed by their unlikely friendship, both ultimately enriched by the profound understanding that music, in its truest form, is not about perfection or professional achievement, but about the deep human need to express what cannot be said in words, to connect with others through the universal language of organized sound, and to honor the artist that lives within every human soul, waiting for permission to speak. Soul, waiting for permission to speak.